We're hitting midsummer in Alberta. Inflation is still having an effect, interest rates are high, and we're seeing a major influx of newcomers to our cities. But against that backdrop, Alberta finds itself in a relatively strong economic position, partly thanks to our roaring population growth, renewed vitality in the resource sector, job creation, and strong capital investment. Our snapshot shows that Alberta is once again on track to be Canada's leader in growth. I'm Scott Crockett, and you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast. Today, along with our chief economist, Mike Holden, we'll explore Alberta's biggest challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and deliver bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. Okay, Mike, so we're back again, as we are every quarter, talking about Alberta's economy. Usually, we have our colleague Alicia Planinchich here as well, but she's under the weather today, but you were just so committed to talking about the Alberta economy and getting it to the people as quick as we could, we decided to jump right into it.
That's exactly what's happening right now.
Absolutely. Okay, let's begin with the big, broad overview. Mike, give us, it's called the Snapshot. What's the snapshot of the Alberta economy?
Well, I think we're in a position where the Alberta economy is doing pretty well. Like you said, we're seeing decent, strong growth. We're seeing businesses that are optimistic. There's some tension on the consumer side, but I think, or some worry on the consumer side, but we're, the province is doing pretty well.
Okay, let's talk first about that business side of things. How are businesses feeling today?
Well, we just did a survey of our own BCA members not that long ago, less than a month ago, and they are pretty optimistic. We're seeing hiring expectations are up. We're seeing concerns about labor shortages are falling. Investment levels are going to be high. And there's just generally a fair bit of optimism within the business community right now. And I think part of the reason for that is that, and I'm sure this is something we'll be talking about as we go along, but population growth. We've had so many people moving into Alberta that just by the sheer numbers drives a lot of business and drives a lot of demand. And I think that that's reflected in some of the optimism we're seeing.
Yeah, it can also be a little bit of a shot of adrenaline into an economy and in some ways somewhat short-lived. But we'll get into that. We always say the first thing people care about is their own job. What's happening in the jobs market?
Well, this is interesting. We're seeing we've been in a high interest rate environment for the last while now, and all of that was designed or intended to slow economic growth in order to help bring inflation under control. And we're starting to see some success in that front on the inflation side, but we are also starting to see the job market soften. So across Canada, employment growth has slowed. In Alberta, for the last 3 or 4 months, we've been kind of bouncing around the same level. The good news is that on a year-over-year basis, we've seen very strong employment growth. Alberta is leading the country in private sector job growth, and it's not close. So we're seeing these jobs being created, but one of the issues we have in Alberta right now is that we have so many people coming into the province that we have the unemployment rate is quite high by Alberta standards, is well above the national average, which is something we never used to see. And a lot of that is because we can't create jobs fast enough for all the people that are coming here.
Okay, this is worth unpacking because this is a paradox. And it made me, or at least it appears to be at first glance, because, you began by saying that business optimism is high. And in that latest business expectation survey, more or less across the board, businesses are feeling very optimistic, the most optimistic they have been in years. And then point two, the economic growth projections are pretty strong. So that sounds great. Meanwhile, Calgary is sitting at 8.1% unemployment, and Edmonton's, I think, in the mid 7.5% unemployment kind of range. Those are high numbers. Normally when oil's over 80 and all the economic numbers are pointing in the right direction, you're looking at 4%, maybe 5% unemployment in Alberta. So put a finer point on that. What's going on in that labor market?
Well, I think what's going on is, like I said, first of all, we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown in the job growth, but we've got so many people coming in. So whether it's non-permanent residents on the immigration side or permanent residents, international students, temporary foreign workers, or people moving to Alberta from Ontario and BC, we're seeing large numbers of people doing that. And, they're typically people come to Alberta in the past from other provinces because of our hot economy. Mm-hmm. And our economy is doing okay, but it's not hot like it was at those points in time. And but they're motivated by our affordability. There are better affordability than you'd find in those areas. And so we've got all these people coming in, and without that kind of really hot investment climate that we used to have in the past during these booms, it's so they're moving here for affordability. People are finding jobs, but there's just more people coming than there are jobs being created, and so that drives the unemployment rate up because those people don't have work. And so, you mentioned the Calgary one, and that 8.1% is, I think, the second highest of any major city in Canada. So that's
I think it might be the highest of any major city in Canada, but in that range.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of a shock to the system, I guess, in a way. So we kind of want to let it ride out for 6 months or so and see whether or not that number starts to come down, and people just need a little bit of time to get absorbed into the labor market.
Yeah, that makes sense. It feels to me like, part of this story is some combination of like a good problem to have, so to speak, mixed with a timing issue a little bit. As you were saying, the Alberta economy is creating tons of jobs. I think the report said 70,000 jobs in the past year, and that was up from the same period a year previously. So, that's plenty of jobs, even if it's not red hot, but we're just seeing more people than that moving here. And so that means that, even though you're creating tons of jobs, you're not creating them quite as fast as the number of new people that are coming in. So it takes a little bit of time for that to balance out.
Yeah, that would be exactly what I said, only much more succinctly.
Well, that's my job. Okay, you mentioned kind of affordability and finances, which I think is the second most important thing to most people. But just before we go there, let's talk about what sectors are driving our economy and job creation at the moment.
Sure. So we're seeing a bit of a comeback in the resource sector in a lot of ways. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline is now operating. Oil prices are high. So in a way, it's some of the traditional Alberta strengths are the ones that are driving growth right now. So oil production is expected to hit a new high this year and next year. Like I said, prices are in a solid range, and the differential between the West Texas Intermediate benchmark price and what Canadian producers receive from their oil, there's always a discount there. Right? So whatever the West Texas Intermediate price is, Canadian producers, because they don't have access to foreign markets, get some amount less than that, and that gap has been narrowing, as partly because of TMX coming online. And so there's the traditional strengths in those areas. And then we're also seeing a lot of construction activity, especially on the residential side.
And it's not really popping in the data yet, but I'm gonna put a bet out there, and this is always risky for us, that when we have this conversation again in 3 or so months' time, I think we'll be talking a bunch about the agriculture sector too. We each work a lot with the council's agriculture members, and I say with love that the conditions never are quite perfect for agriculture, right? You always want more moisture or less moisture, or moisture at a different time, or that kind of thing. But even those folks are feeling pretty optimistic, particularly about the potential size of the yield of the crop this year, and most prices for most commodities are reasonable. So I think that could be an emerging area of strength.
Yeah, and that's a far cry from where we thought we would be 6 months ago.
No kidding.
Looking at this summer, so that is fantastic news.
Yeah, little plug on that though. Let's not let the near crisis go to waste. We were within a hair's breadth of a drought, and which created some momentum to actually do some of the things we probably should have done a while ago, like more water storage. And I think we need to keep that momentum up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let's move on to people's finances. So when Albertans are sitting around their kitchen table and they're talking about their finances with their partner, how are they feeling?
It's a bit of a struggle, I think. I mean, for a lot of Albertans still, we've got, high prices from inflation. So even if inflation has come down, we talked about this last time, just because inflation is slower doesn't mean prices have come back down. That just means they're growing at a slower rate. So things are more expensive. Housing costs and rental costs across the province, and especially in the Calgary area and the rental side, have been skyrocketing. And so there are some affordability concerns here. Right. Up until recently, we haven't seen wages able to match the spending needs of Albertans. So, there's some worry on the consumer side.
Put some numbers to those rent increases. How much has rent been going up in Alberta, and how does that compare to other Canadians?
Well, we've seen across the province that rent compared to a year ago, it's up almost 16%, which is, it's a huge increase. And it's, as I said, it's even higher in the Calgary area. Edmonton is doing better. And I think that one of the interesting things, and one of the sort of good news components to this, which I'll come back to some of the spending stuff in a second here, but something that is a good news story in the context of this housing shortages and rising costs and people coming in, is that Alberta is building a lot of homes. You know, I think it's somewhere around 40,000 housing starts.
Which would be a record, I think.
Yeah. And that's
30, maybe 35 would be, as far as I know, the most that we would have ever built in the past.
To start the year. Yeah, for the first half of the year, I believe. And so it's a great number. I mean, we're not really sure because Stats can't stop tracking completions of houses. So we don't, so we know they're building a lot.
We've started a lot.
Yeah, we started a lot. We don't know anymore we don't know whether they're being finished or not, but we're seeing a lot of that kind of housing activity, and that's a good news story.
Okay, so if Albertans sitting around their kitchen table are not necessarily feeling spectacularly about their family budget, you know, and I think the number from the report was about half of Albertans, don't feel secure about their finances at the moment. What are they doing about that? Are they cutting back on spending? And if so, where and why?
Yeah, they are to some degree. And so this is one of the interesting stories that comes with large-scale population growth. So if you look at the headline numbers of Alberta's retail sales, they're more or less flat. You know, we're not seeing a lot of growth, but we're not seeing it fall either. But on a per person basis, we're absolutely seeing overall consumer spending is declining. Retail sales are down, but they're down in specific areas. So what we're seeing is things like clothing, incidental purchases on, restaurants, hospitality, that kind of stuff. Those sort of discretionary purchases, those are down, and things like sporting goods as well. And what's interesting is that there is a bit of offsetting growth in certain other areas, aspects of retail sales.
Like where?
And well, again, I think this is likely tied to people moving into the province. You move to Alberta and you're going to need furniture. And so we've got, home goods. You need a new car. So there's motor vehicle sales are high and sort of health and personal care items. And so we're seeing declines in some of those areas of the sort of discretionary purchases, and then things that are more immediately needed, sort of, kind of larger durable goods kinds of purchases are up.
Okay. So the discretionaries are down, the larger durable goods are up. And then there's this sort of middle category that I think is really interesting. And these would be ones where the total volume of sales is up, but on a per person basis, it's down. So I think about this from the days when I worked retail as like a young man, and you'd be measured on kind of two different things, right? You'd be measured on how many sales the store did that day, and then you'd be measured on kind of like the average value of your sale. And the average value of the sale was often a kind of interesting indicator of the economy. Were people buying the more expensive pair of shoes, and would they add a fancy pair of socks on as well, or were they just into just get their kids, whatever shoes they sort of needed. So, can you describe for us which kinds of goods are in that middle category, total sales up, but average sale down?
There's a couple of them, and, so just to sort of give it away, the two of them right now are spending at gas stations, so like fueling up your car, and at hardware stores, building and garden center kinds of things. And so on the one hand, the gas stations isn't a huge surprise with, the price of fuel's relatively high compared to what it had been a few years ago. There's demand for gasoline is in general slowing, or it's plateaued, I guess.
Plateauing, sure.
And so, on a per person basis, people are buying less, but there's so many more of us around that overall sales are up. And the same thing with, building hardware stores and garden centers and places like that. And so that's another area where traffic is driving sales, but people are buying fewer things from them. And why that is, I remember we talked about this a couple of years ago, where it was the opposite. When during COVID, people couldn't go out, they couldn't do much of anything, so they just had massive, home renovation projects. And so there's a huge spike in sales in those places. So we might just be seeing there's nothing left to renovate. Right.
Yeah. We've already built the deck. Yep. One of our members who supplies wood told me during that huge home renovation boom, no one who worked at the company was allowed to build their own deck because, demand had never been stronger. It's like, build your deck some other time, just not right now. Let's talk a little bit about that gap between wage growth and increasing costs. So, you talked about rent is up, nearly 16% across Alberta. I don't know anybody that, got handed an across the board 16% raise. You talked about inflation, how even if the growth in prices has come down, the inflation is baked in. Milk is 20% more expensive today than it was a few years ago. What are wages doing?
Well, wages are starting to come back up finally. So, this is this had been an area of concern in Alberta for a while. So, if you rewind 10 years or so, or much longer ago than that, we all got very used to the fact that Alberta had the highest wages of any province in Canada. And it really wasn't close at times, especially from that kind of, 2000 to 2015 kind of period. And since the oil price crash in 2015, we've seen, weaker wage growth, and especially since COVID. And so we've other provinces have gradually been catching up. So Alberta had this weak wage growth, and when inflation was high and was rising, and so we got this big gap where the cost of all the things that you're buying is going up a lot faster than your paycheck is getting bigger. And so that's a huge challenge. You add that plus the affordability concerns and in terms of housing, and so a lot of Albertans were feeling like they weren't getting ahead, and that's started to change. We've seen wage growth accelerate in Alberta and converge more or less with the Canadian average. So now our wages are going up at the same rate as everybody else's, and inflation is continuing to come down, and we're starting to see some general wage gains. Except we're not out of the woods yet, though, because there are a couple of different ways average wages go up. This is one of the challenges with looking at averages all the time. So if you either you can get a raise within your current job, or if you switch jobs and get a higher paying job someplace else, your average wage is going to go up. But it's not. But it's a different kind of compositional effect, right? So it's not a raise. It's just you got a better job. Your old job still exists.
Right, probably paying the same as it was before.
Yeah, exactly. So we're still seeing a little bit of weakness in that kind of situation where if you control for things like the type of job and experience level, we're not getting the kind of wage growth that we'd seen before. It's just more of compositional shifts in the economy that are driving some of the wage gains. So, it's not a super bad news story, but we're not out of the woods yet on the wage front.
We probably want to see wages going up faster than inflation for a prolonged period, to catch up. It's funny when you're talking about compositional effects. I think one of my favorite ones that you and I haven't talked about for a while, or favorite example ones, and it's not like I liked the situation, but during COVID, I think we saw average wages actually increase.
Oh yeah.
And that was because so many of the jobs that were most deeply impacted and eliminated were sort of relatively low wage jobs, like a host or a hostess at a restaurant, for instance, that for many people is a first job and pays something close-ish to minimum wage. Well, when those jobs were eliminated, but lawyers' jobs were not, because they largely found that they could do those jobs from a home office, the average wage actually increased.
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. Yep, exactly that. And in fact, because of the other interesting fun fact with that same kind of compositional effect is that the wage gap between men and women narrowed considerably during that period, because a lot of the types of jobs that tend to be female dominated also tend to be lower wage jobs, and so a lot of those, and in the hospitality jobs,
in particular,
female dominated, or at least skewed in that direction. And so you remove that, you remove a lot of relatively low paying jobs for women, and suddenly the average female salary goes up relative to men and narrows that gap.
Right, for the worst possible reason.
For exactly the worst possible reason.
All right, as we begin to close in on the end of this, let's zoom out. Tell me what your kind of projections are for the Alberta economy. And maybe I'll ask you, start with, now that we actually have a view of how the past year ended up, what does this year look like, and what do you think is going to happen in the future?
There's so many things that happen to affect that it's hard to even know what to talk about. I think one of the important points is, we're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to dealing with inflation and high interest rates. And so I think it might take a little while for this to happen, but it's going to put some wind in the sails of the Alberta economy. And since Alicia's not here, I can use all the nautical metaphors I want.
For any of you who are listening to this podcast for the first time, we have a long-running joke that our landlocked province is very fond of nautical metaphors.
Or at least the chief economist for the Business Council of Alberta is. But yeah, so inflation is coming down. Canada was the first mover, but other countries are starting to lower their interest rates as well. And it's going to be a gradual process, but it's going to really help out, because one of the problems that we've been able to avoid so far is we haven't seen a lot of bankruptcies. We haven't seen a lot of Albertans and Canadians in general. They're feeling financial stress, but it hasn't gotten to any extreme point. And then there's a large number of Canadians who have fixed rate mortgages that are going to be coming up. And so the longer interest rates stay high, the more people are going to be renewing those mortgages at those higher rates. And so there's a shock that we haven't gone through yet. And so as interest rates start to come down, it's going to lessen the magnitude of that shock. So that's, it's not as much a good news story as much as it is a less bad news story.
Right.
And so we have that. And then the global economy, I think, is doing a little bit better than people thought. The United States is doing better. And whenever the U.S. does well, that tends to again, put more wind in Canada's sails. So we have some positives happening here. And again, we come back to the population growth. That's always going to keep the economy moving. And I think that what comes with that is a need for a lot of investment in infrastructure. We're going to need more schools, we're going to need more hospitals, we need more teachers and doctors and skilled tradespeople especially. And so, with some proper policy planning, I think that we can be in a good position. I think that, the economy will start to slow a little bit, but, I think what we're trying to get at the end of the day is a gentle landing and then pick back up again.
Right. You make a strong case that, especially when some timing is factored in, immigration or interprovincial migration, population growth in Alberta is still a huge net positive. But, one of the ways I think about this is roughly 200,000 new people moved to Alberta last year.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's like a Lethbridge and a Red Deer. Like adding the third and fourth largest cities in Alberta to Alberta. And if you think about every home, every school, every fire hall, every community center in Lethbridge and Red Deer, I think it's going to take probably 7 or more years to actually kind of catch up with all of the building and infrastructure needs. And that's likely to create, jobs and construction boom and things like that as we do it in the coming years.
Yeah. And, as I said, we're seeing there's a lot of optimism with this. We talked at the very beginning of this podcast about industries and businesses. And so, we have data in the Snapshot looking at the levels of optimism that we're seeing in the province. And it's high everywhere. We're looking at 80, 90% in some cases, in some industries are either very optimistic or somewhat optimistic about what's going to be happening in Alberta. And so it continues to be an exciting place to be.
It sure does. Well, and for any of our listeners, if you're interested in the graphs and the backup behind anything what we've talked about so far, we'll put a link to the full report in the show notes and a few of the big graphs. Mike, lightning round to wrap this up. If you're only watching one indicator for the next 3 months, what's it going to be?
I'd be watching inflation again. I mean, it's kind of a boring answer, but everybody's expecting that interest rates are going to start to come down. We've got a policy decision coming in the third week of July, and we're expecting that the rates are going to start to come down and all that. Whether that continues depends on the kind of GDP numbers and the inflation numbers that we're seeing. So it's one indicator, but there's many things that feed into it.
Many things that feed in. Yeah, you're cheating like an economist. You pick an indicator that's a roll up of many others. I'll tell you the one that I'm interested in following, maybe not exactly an indicator, but it's about newcomer success actually in Alberta. Tons of new people are moving here. Our economic indicators are all kind of pointing in the right direction, but unemployment is sort of relatively high. And, I was meeting with the CEO of one of Alberta's, in fact, Western Canada's largest newcomer serving agencies recently. And she was telling me, if you go visit a drop-in center in Calgary or Edmonton today, what you're going to see is actually quite a lot of newcomers, folks who have moved here for the promise of Alberta, but haven't necessarily succeeded right away yet. And, I think that's something to watch because that's a different kind of population than I saw last time I visited the DI.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in fact, you saying that made me change my own answer.
Okay. What is it now?
The answer now is what we touched on earlier, and that's the unemployment rate within the province, the various unemployment rates. And so we talked about Calgary having, the highest of any major city in the country. Edmonton's is going up to, it's still a full percentage point or so less, but they're at high numbers. And so if I am talking about the fact that the economy is not creating jobs at the same pace as the population is growing, that's a question of whether we start to be able to close the gap between those two things and have people settle in, find work, and contribute to making Alberta an even better place. And so looking to see that unemployment rate fall and see whether we get some convergence with the national average.
Well, let's both hope for that. Thanks for joining us today. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and giving us a quick review and a rating, or tell a friend about the show.